What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Here we are with another reaction. In this, we have India proves China is a paper tiger. China's troops get smoked in first combat disaster. Oh, shoot. Before we dive in, if you guys happen to enjoy, please don't forget to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and let's get to it. Also, if you want to support the channel by becoming a member, all you gotta do is hit that join button to receive your exclusive benefits.
China is closely watching the war between India and Pakistan. That's because China is rapidly expanding its military. Its military budget is growing every single year. It's buying lots of weapons and training millions of soldiers. And the goal is to take over the US someday. That's why the India-Pakistan war is of close interest to the CCP. This is, in fact, one of the first time Chinese equipment is being used in a war. But some people are calling China a paper tiger, and that's because of its army. Although the People's Liberation Army could probably defend the CCP in China, it's not ready for a war abroad. That's because the PLA doesn't have combat experience. Its last war was an invasion of Vietnam in 1979, which went very poorly. In recent years, they've only fought as a part of the UN peacekeeping operations. One of these UN deployments ended in a horrible disaster, killing 2 Chinese soldiers. To understand why China is struggling with global power projection, it's worth looking at this incident. Now, this incident exposed the whole world to how bad the Chinese army truly is. So you know CCP bots are not going to like this video, and they will probably attack it with all they've got to kill its reach. So if you can help us fight these bots by hitting the like and subscribe button down below, it would really help us out tremendously. Thank you. In 2015, China decided to send troops to support UN operations. Years after it joined the UN Truce Supervision Organization back in 1990. They sent 700 Chinese troops and commanders in total, forming the 1st Chinese UN Infantry Battalion. This battalion was sent to Juba, the capital of the newly formed Republic of South Sudan. It's the newest country in the world, only separating from Sudan back in 2011. But in 2013, just 2 years after the country's formation, South Sudan entered a civil war. President Salva Kiir accused the vice president, Riek Machar, of wanting to take over the government, which was the start of a grueling multi-sided civil war with lots of ethnic violence. Ultimately, the conflict only ended years later in 2020, causing nearly 400,000 war-related deaths, creating 1.5 million refugees, and displacing another 2 million within the country. But in August of 2015, there seemed to be hope after both sides agreed to a ceasefire agreement. It would be protected by peacekeepers from the United Nations mission to South Sudan, or UNMISS. The Chinese peacekeepers stationed at Juba were supposed to protect and provide aid to the local population in the capital, a city of more than 300,000 people at that time. The Chinese peacekeepers weren't alone, though, as India, Ethiopia, and Rwanda and others also contributed a lot of troops. In total, there were 12,500 troops from 61 different countries in South Sudan, with a couple thousand stationed in the capital alone. The Chinese troops were stationed at the western side of the capital, at its perimeter. It included the UN House and 2 refugee camps called Protection of Civilians Site 1 and 3. There was also another UN perimeter to the northeast near the airport of Juba, where the other countries had their troops. This perimeter near the airport was a logistics hub, and it had a level 2 hospital with surgical tools. It was also way closer to the city center, where most of the international embassies were. But the peacekeeping operation at Juba was doomed to fail. While these UN units were in the city, the 2 sides of the conflict got increasingly anxious. Violating the peace treaty, soldiers on both sides began to set up bases near or inside the capital. The rebel forces alone sent 1,400 soldiers to the capital, right next to where the government forces were stationed. In total, there were 10 Sudanese military camps in or around the city. This was bound to go wrong, and on the 3rd of July, a lieutenant loyal to the vice president was killed. 4 days later, on the 7th of July, a fight broke out, killing 5 soldiers loyal to the president. And from that point, things really started to go south. The following day, Kiir and Machar wanted to put an end to the violence by meeting each other at the presidential palace. But the vice president's bodyguards and the presidential battalion got into a gunfight during the press conference. In Juba, the troops on both sides got very angry and a full-on battle started. The government forces...
What on earth is it going South Sudan? For a civil war to be from 2013 to 2020, for 400,000 people to die, for 1 million to create 1.5 million refugees and displace 2 million people is absolutely bonkers. And then to see you guys trying to come together and create peace, and then your bodyguards and your battalions and everybody going at it. Everybody gunfights. When I say going at, I mean gunfights. Jeez Louise.
eventually secured most of the city. The UN peacekeepers stayed on the sidelines, and for the time being, the UN bases were left unscathed. However, on the 10th of July, President Kiir ordered the assassination of Machar. Government forces rampaged through the city using tanks, artillery, fighter jets, and helicopters with no regard for the rules of war. For days, government forces were free to loot the city and commit countless war crimes, killing hundreds of civilians. Seeing all of this, the peacekeepers still refused to go outside of their perimeter to try and put an end to the violence. Even worse, the protection of civilian sites themselves weren't safe. Tens of thousands of civilians fled to the UN sites in search of safety, adding to the thousands of people that were already there. But the UN camps got caught in the crossfire of machine guns and artillery strikes. And it wasn't like these camps had some sophisticated defenses. They had some barbed wire, metal gates, and several wooden watchtowers, and that's it. There were no things like advanced bomb shelters or reinforced concrete walls. Because the situation was so dire, Chinese troops abandoned the outer area of the perimeter and retreated to the center, leaving many civilians and humanitarian aid workers without protection. Unfortunately,
so if you in the UN camps, ain't you supposed to protect the people? Now, you not being able to step outside of them UN camps and help, I hate it, but I get it. I hate it, but I get it. But while you at them UN camps, you should be able to protect everybody inside. Those are your camps, and they know that. And so for you guys to just, when trouble comes, walk away and leave all them undefended, that's not right.
10th of July, a bomb hit one of the armored personnel carriers, killing 2 Chinese peacekeepers and injuring 8. There was only a level 1 clinic inside the perimeter without advanced medical tools, so the Chinese peacekeepers were unable to treat combat wounds effectively. They also couldn't go to the hospital at the airport because of the violence that was going on in the city. This lack of medical care was likely the reason why the second Chinese peacekeeper who lost his life in the attack didn't make it. While the peacekeeping mission was falling apart, Sudanese soldiers rampaged through the refugee camps, stealing $30 million of UN supplies, including enough food to feed 200,000 people for a month. They also did horrible things to the refugees that we can't cover here on YouTube. The Chinese peacekeeping operation wasn't a complete failure, though, because they managed to shelter 9,000 civilians at the center of the camp. However, with more than 300 civilian casualties, including 20 in the refugee camp itself, and humanitarian workers being assaulted just outside the camps, many criticized China's performance. This included the American Center for Civilians in Conflict, or CIVIC. They blamed the Chinese peacekeepers for not doing their duty, claiming that a lot of the violence could have been prevented. Allegedly, the UN had ordered the peacekeepers to set up a wider perimeter and pull both sides apart, but the Chinese troops and the other peacekeepers never left their bases. Instead, they abandoned their post and only returned fire on a few occasions. Former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon also wasn't happy with what happened, and he ordered an independent investigation. The following UN report blamed chaotic leadership for failing to protect civilians from horrible violence. It also confirmed that multiple requests were made to stand up a quick reaction force to respond, but each UN mission contingent turned down the request. Ultimately, the 1,800 UN infantry troops were underused during the battle. If we put ourselves in their shoes, it's pretty understandable that they didn't want to leave the bases. They only had a couple of these white armored personnel carriers and light arms. That's nothing when you're confronting armies with mortars, tanks, and fighter jets. Also, it's incredibly difficult if you have to pull 2 sides apart while they're fighting each other. And UN peacekeepers weren't allowed to use force either. As peacekeepers, you can only use force for self-defense, or when it's absolutely necessary in order to protect civilians. Ultimately, the situation proved too complicated for the peacekeepers to handle. Another reason for the failure was that the UN forces didn't operate under unified command. There were conflicting orders from the Chinese, Ethiopian, Nepalese, and Indian troops. And the Chinese troops refused to take orders from foreign commanders because they weren't trained to do so. And this wasn't the only problem with their training. In fact, the Chinese peacekeepers didn't even understand the rules of engagement, repeatedly asking their commanders who they're allowed to shoot. This only added to the chaos and the confusion. But if the peacekeepers aren't able to do anything when it gets tough, what's even the point of having peacekeeping operations? Ultimately, their mandate was to protect civilians from violence. But with hundreds of civilian casualties at the Battle of Juba, they objectively failed. Of course, China
on everything. So when they talk about self-defense and peacekeepers being able to use their weapons in self-defense, do that mean self-defense against them and as well as the people that they're protecting? Like if somebody tries to come and harm the people that they're protecting, they're allowed to defend those people, correct? If that's the case, then yeah, China is absolutely slacking on their job. And the fact that they would leave their bases unprotected when trouble came is crazy. And that's assuming that self-defense, they're allowed to take out those who are trying to harm the people that they're protecting. Um, yeah.
China denies all these accusations. A spokesperson for the Chinese Defense Ministry said that the Civic report was malicious speculation. He claimed that Chinese peacekeeping officers and soldiers remained at their posts, quickly organizing reinforcements and continuing to implement the mandate of UN MISS while rescuing wounded soldiers. Of course, the independent UN investigation put a hole in this argument. But still, China argues that it was never their duty to protect people outside of the perimeter, and that the order to pull both sides apart was unrealistic. There were no major ramifications after the battle ended, although China did ask the South Sudanese government to punish those responsible for the killing of 2 Chinese peacekeepers. Meanwhile, the Chinese peacekeeping operations in Juba only continued. The troops had to be replaced, though, in part because they were too traumatized to do any peacekeeping. During their patrols, they refused to exit their armored vehicles and only dared to peek through the windows. But ever since, China has sent a new battalion every year, and in December of 2024,
South Sudan, people, what them soldiers doing out there? They scared to even leave a vehicle.
11th Peacekeeping Battalion was welcomed in Juba. According to the UN, these new Chinese peacekeepers are combat ready. They've probably learned from some of their past mistakes because Xi Jinping ordered a major restructuring of the Chinese military in 2017, 1 year after the Juba disaster. All in all, the mission wasn't a complete failure for China because it allowed them to learn and improve. That's also why China continued to join new UN peacekeeping missions, even after the disaster at Juba. Since 2015, China has sent more than 50,000 soldiers abroad on 24 different UN peacekeeping missions, becoming the 9th biggest contributor of Blue Helmets. In total, 16 Chinese peacekeepers have lost their lives during these missions, making the ultimate sacrifice in service of others. China is also prepared to give a lot of money, becoming the 2nd biggest funder of UN peacekeeping, only behind the US. This is all very helpful, because it helps to maintain stability in the most vulnerable countries around the world. But as people are pointing out, it also serves China's own goals of getting influence abroad.
Yeah.
South Sudan is actually a big example of this. The country has a ton of oil, with almost 4 billion barrels in proven reserves.
Oh, yeah. Y'all know, not only is China going to be there, but the U.S. going to start knocking on the door. When you talk about oil, oh, best believe New York, the U.S. going to come knocking on the door soon.
The Dar Petroleum Operating Company in Sudan currently produces 90,000 barrels of oil per day. And China owns a 41% stake in this company in order to secure oil supplies for the Chinese market.
Never mind,
in part,
U.S.
China's
ain't getting that
peacekeepers were
oil.
sent to South Sudan to protect these oil interests. There's also 3 trillion cubic feet of untapped natural gas in Sudan and South Sudan combined. Other natural resources include iron ore, copper, gold, and rare earth metals. Because the country is still underdeveloped, there are a ton of opportunities in infrastructure.
Yeah.
China recently finished a new infrastructure project in South Sudan called the Clement Mboro Bridge. But it's also trying to get influence in the country with more shady deals. China is one of the biggest supplier of arms to both sides of the South Sudan conflict.
Oh, wow.
So no matter which side wins, they're dependent on China. Still, it's very ironic to be selling arms and peacekeeping at the same time. It just shows what China's own ambitions are in South Sudan, namely getting influence and getting combat experience.
Yeah.
And the UN kind of takes this as a given that countries always act out of self-interest. After all, China's contributions are still net positive for the organization. However, going back to China's fundamental problem with combat experience, UN peacekeeping might not be the solution. The Chinese peacekeepers can learn a lot about how to operate military bases and how to deal with threats. But UN peacekeeping operations are always very limited. You see, Juba wasn't the first place where UN peacekeeping operations have failed. It has happened multiple times that UN peacekeepers got caught in the crossfire and failed to protect the local civilians. One of the worst failures in UN peacekeeping history happened during the Bosnian War, with the Srebrenica massacre in 1995. It was the worst genocide in Europe after World War II, with over 8,000 Bosniaks killed by Bosnian Serbs. Worst of all, these civilians thought they were protected by UN battalions from the Netherlands. But the so-called Dutch Bat only had 370 peacekeepers, and they were only lightly armed. They were no match for the Bosnian Serb army, and when the Serbs wanted to massacre the local population, Dutch Bat couldn't do anything. But an even worse failure happened in Rwanda a year earlier, during the 1994 Rwandan massacre. 800,000 people were killed in the span of 100 days. and the UN peacekeepers in
God
Rwanda failed to
dang.
intervene.
800,000
There were less than
in the
3,000
span of
peacekeepers in the whole
100
country,
days.
and they were severely under-equipped.
Yeah.
Now, the UN is constantly trying to improve its missions, but the fundamental problem remains. That's because the UN has all kinds of rules about peaceful conflict resolution.
Man.
So there are very strict rules of engagement for the
Be
peacekeepers.
like, I'm gonna try to keep it as peaceful as I possibly can. But y'all don't understand, like y'all asking us to break these two sides up, but do it in a peaceful manner. And these sides ain't ain't following the same rule book. They don't care about peace. They throwing us out the way. They taking shots. Removing us as an obstacle in their path. And it ain't much we can do because of the rules we got to follow.
And they don't have a lot of lethal weapons at their disposal. This all sounds great in theory, but it means that many missions are doomed to fail. In the end, UN missions don't have the lethal force that's necessary in combat, and they often lack advanced equipment like tanks, fighter jets, and artillery. This is also tied to budget constraints and a reluctance by countries to put their own military equipment on the line.
Of course.
If this isn't fixed, there might be a Juba 2.0, where the peacekeepers are paralyzed and unable to join the fight. With that in mind, China might need to look for a new strategy to get combat experience. One of the options is to bypass the UN altogether and to help countries directly with peacekeeping and counterterrorism operations.
That might be a better option.
This has a number of advantages, especially if you're trying to train your own troops without many complicated rules. But the downside is that this makes other countries suspicious. The US has a reputation for intervening in foreign wars, but it doesn't want China to do the same.
No.
Also, the host countries might have their reservations about inviting Chinese troops over to join their conflict. Understandably, they'd rather have UN blue helmets, and inviting American or European peacekeepers also has its benefits. But China desperately wants the People's Liberation Army to set up bases around the world, and Djibouti is the first country where China has been successful. In 2017, China opened its first foreign military base in Djibouti, operated by the Chinese Navy. Allegedly, it's for anti-piracy, evacuation operations, peacekeeping, and counterterrorism. But it's also used for global power projection, because Djibouti is strategically located near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the most important waterways for international trade. The location is pretty awkward, though, because a few miles from there, the Americans also have a base called Camp Lemonnier.
Really?
Understandably so, Washington didn't appreciate it when Djibouti invited the Chinese over in 2017.
I can imagine
Ever since,
they wouldn't.
both the US and China have been constantly spying on each other's bases.
Of course.
China also uses the base to monitor what the US is doing in the Red Sea with the Houthis to try and study American military strategies. With China desperately trying to expand its...
China ain't no fools. China said we come hell or high water, we coming for that top spot. And the US said come hell and high water, we will defend it.
global military presence, there could be many more of these situations in the future. Another way for China to get combat experience, or a substitute for it, is doing large-scale training exercises. In 2009, the PLA launched its first ever massive military drill involving 50,000 troops to stress test its infrastructure and logistics. They also train regularly with Russia and Central Asian countries under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Russia obviously has more combat experience than China, carrying the Soviet legacy. Since 1991, they've also fought in Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, and obviously in Ukraine since 2014. On top of that, Russia has a lot of mercenaries fighting in African countries like Mali and the Central African Republic. So the PLA has a lot to learn from their Russian counterpart. In 2018, when Russia held its largest war games since the Cold War in Siberia, China was also invited. The PLA sent 3,500 troops with tanks and aircraft. It was a success because China later joined new Russian military exercises in 2019 and 2021. Since 2019, China has also been holding annual naval exercises with Russia and Iran to simulate naval battles and to stress test their systems. But obviously, the most infamous Chinese military exercises revolve around Taiwan. They have picked up in recent years, with China simulating naval blockades, airstrikes, and sea assaults. Obviously, the goal is to refine Chinese military capabilities to eventually take over the island. However, it's not clear whether the PLA will get there with their military exercises alone. Because as China's first combat disaster in South Sudan showed, the PLA isn't yet ready to deal with the unpredictable and chaotic realities of war. If this happens during a relatively small operation in South Sudan, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But if China makes the same mistakes in an actual war scenario, the consequences are unimaginable.
Be
Thanks for
cooked.
watching.
Be
YouTube
absolutely
just
cooked.
dropped a mine.
Y'all talk to me in the comment section. Please let me know what you think. If you enjoyed the video, also don't forget to subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, check out the next. I'll see y'all next time.